Hello folks, welcome back to our recorded lectures for ML303. This is The Fantasy of the Medieval, Modern Secret Societies and Their Medieval Origin Stories. So I'd like to begin by talking about the nature of the secret society as a whole, just the concept of it, what it means, some of the theories that have been discussed by scholars about what constitutes a secret society, why it takes the shape that it does. So one of the earliest works, systematic works we know of, on the idea of a secret society is George Simmels' The Sociology of Secrecy and of Secret Societies. So he introduced the concept that, first of all, a secret is a social relationship based on reciprocal confidence, and when it becomes the chief organizing principle of a group, it shapes the course of the group's development. So a secret society can be a protective measure. It's often adopted under hostile political conditions. So for instance, in contexts where you have a despotic government, the secret society exists to protect the group and to create for the members of the group a space of freedom outside surveillance and control. Now, on one hand, this is a great idea. On the other hand, the demands on the group are very, very high. Each person involved in a secret society has to have the ability to keep silent. This is a high level of trust. You cannot be a member of a secret society and violate the trust of the others involved. This can be too much for people to live up to. So the group has to develop mechanisms to retain members' commitment to the secret. So in other words, make violating trust come with a high cost. And the phrase for this is moral solidarity. Now, because of the need to design the group to include these mechanisms, it can come off seeming somewhat artificial and self-conscious. So a secret society is rarely an organic evolution, mostly because it has to be hierarchical. If you are going, another way to ensure that people can be trusted with the secret is to allow for different levels of access to the secret. You prove yourself and win acceptance into the inner circle. There have been arguments that have said that this means that secret societies are actually fundamentally aristocratic in nature. Now, you can also say that this builds in a specific weakness. When the outside world is the enemy, internal life becomes all important. Members will compete to outdo each other in virtue, to recruit new members. This can lead to internal dissension. The demands of the discipline involved can lead to a loss of individuality. Now, the secret society is also prone to drifting. If its initial purpose becomes lost or is fulfilled, and yet the secret society continues, the walls and the boundaries can still work. Everything that separates it from mainstream society can still stay in existence, but it can become obsolete. Now, when a secret society operates within a culture that it tries specifically to disassociate itself from, power holders in the culture can react to it negatively, and this has the capacity to stimulate aggression. Examples of this might be mystery religions in the classical period. Now, other theorists suggest that the range of secret societies is a reflection of a variety of approaches to male bonding. To be honest, not a lot of secret societies prior to the later 20th century actually involved women at all. All right, so that hopefully gives you some grounding in the nature of the type of organization we're talking about. And so, of course, now we are going to move to discussing Freemasonry, because that is today's subject. All right, so a couple of things that need to be laid out here right at the beginning. When you mention Masons, you're talking about a guild. Unquestionably, they have medieval origins. And there were two different types of Masons in the Middle Ages. The rough Masons, who worked with foundations and walls, and the Masons who carved things like cathedral facades from freestone. And so these were often called Freemasons as a result. Now, like many craft guilds, mutual help associations within the guild developed early on. And if you look at guilds of masons by the 16th century, their meetings involved Bible reading, some private signs and rituals, general exclusivity. You had to be a member of the guild to take part in any of this. It's not uncharacteristic of medieval guilds to develop these traits. Now we can see this looking at most craft guilds, as I said. Now, the earliest document that we call a Freemason document is the Regius poem from the Halliwell manuscript. And it was written by an anonymous author in 1390 or thereabouts, likely copied from earlier documents. It's a poem that lays down the standards of morality and conduct that Masons were expected to abide by. Talks about things like workmanship, moral behavior, the importance of friendship amongst the members, and it seems to have inspired most later documents and codes of conduct from the Freemason period. Now, this exists. You see it in the image there. We know the Regius poem is a real thing. Now, what we don't really know a lot about is the early modern development of the Freemasons. That's a nice way of saying there may not actually be any direct connection between the Freemasons and the Craft Masons. Maybe a matter of inspiration more than anything else. Now, by 1700, we do actually see groups where the focus shifted to Bible study, and it allowed for the involvement of non-artisans. And these are sometimes called admitted or speculative Masons. You might ask yourself why this happened. Certainly, by the early 18th century, craft guilds were in difficulty, and they needed to raise funds. So recruitment, even of people who weren't actually members of the craft, was a possibility. In England in particular, the guilds had been hit very hard by the dissolution of the monasteries, so there's suddenly a lot less work available for Masons. There's some suspicion that in the Tudor period, craft guilds were anti-government for various reasons, so there were attempts to suppress them. The government, however, realized that the Masons were useful to them, so they weren't long-term attempts. Now, early modern Masonic histories talk about Scottish craft lodges being in operation, being minded by crown officials. By minded, I mean overseen. They mention early regulations, connections to the St. Clair family that built Rosslyn Chapel. It's all very hazy, but the Scottish lodges in particular do record instances of admission of speculative Masons. So if we're looking for the evidence of direct ties, it's probably the best there. It's safe to say that these speculative Masons, when we started seeing them, were probably drawn to the ritual aspects, to the idea of the secret society. There's some suggestion that there may actually have been more speculative lodges in southern England, whereas in northern England and in Scotland, you had either operative lodges of actual Masons or mixed lodges. Now, the next main date is 1717, which was the founding of the Grand Lodge in London, when 4 of the existing lodges came together. There were actually no minutes taken on their meetings until 1723, so this is a very foggy few years. Now, as the Grand Lodge period got going, however, it was clear that the Masons were no longer led by actual Masons, but by gentlemen. So George Payne, the second Grand Master, was a civil servant. He was the last commoner to be the Grand Master. In general, the focus of the speculative Masonic groups shifted to focus on things like rationalism and deism. They wanted to explore the wisdom of the past. Intellectual activity takes over from the traditional artisan focus. In general, to be a Mason in this period meant to be somebody who was developing their social and moral virtues. What got used from the medieval period was the language and the symbolism of the medieval Masons. So a well-built building is a symbol for a well-built character. Now, they were non-denominational, and that's an interesting thing, given, the uproar about religion in the early modern period in Western Europe. But in general, the Masons did recognize some form of supreme being. It depended on who you were. The members were supposed to better humanity through the course of their own lives. In that way, they are a creature of the Enlightenment, you might say. And in the 18th century, we actually see new Masonic documents being created. The Gothic constitutions in 1738. Some people argue that this was actually created from earlier medieval material. Certainly it may have been inspired by the Regius poem. James Anderson is the one who creates the Gothic constitutions, and he's basically trying to create a history for the Masons that ties the craft back to biblical roots, all the way to the Israelite period, actually. This is also sometimes called the York Legend, and it also draws information from another Masonic manuscript, the Cook manuscript, in 1450. So the York Legend suggests that the Masonry is an order helped establish England during Athelstan's reign in the 10th century. And supposedly when he became king, that's when the first assembly of Masons was held. There was a son added to the royal line in this legend, and this is Prince Edwin, that supposedly loved Masons and geometry so much that he took part in the order. And that's a really nice story, except that when you look at every other piece of the historical record, Athelstan did not appear to have a son. At least not that we know of. Now, the constitutions listed what it called the Grand Masters of Masonry, and this went all the way back to a figure called Austin the Monk. We are pretty sure, cross-referencing with longer discussions of Austin from other documents, that this is actually a reference to Augustine of Canterbury, the first bishop of Canterbury in the 7th century. So this is another case where a legendary genealogy is being bound up inextricably with a historical genealogy, such as it is. Okay. The spread of the Freemasons. We know they spread from Britain into the Netherlands, France, Germany, elsewhere. In all of these places, Freemasonry is seen as odd and a little unsettling, and perhaps even something to be watched carefully. But the reason for that is that it's an import. I mean, at this point, they're still a middle-class organization, import or not. They're fraternal. They have a perceived connection to Solomon's Temple, which was spun into a connection with the Crusades. So one of the first people to do this was Andrew Michael Ramsay, and he was a Jacobite exile living in France. He's a Scotsman in 1736 and 1737. In case you have never heard of the Jacobite rebellions, there were two of them in the first half of the 18th century. It involved Scotland rising up against England. Neither of them were successful. Now, what Ramsay did is he introduced a fictitious Crusader biography for the Freemasons, and also a concept that it was an aristocratic society in its origins. I mean, it's not true when you look at British Freemasonry, but if it's cast that way, it's much more appealing to French gentry and nobility, which was his intended audience. If you cast them as an ancient, chivalrous, international secret society, whose rights were preserved only amongst the Scots in any kind of accurate fashion, you might find sort of an in into elite levels of French society. Now, he did not say that all of the Masons were Templars. He may actually have been suggesting that the Masons were Hospitallers. But really, did he need to say the Masons were based on the Templars? No, because everybody likes to think the Templars are everywhere. Not just at that point in history, obviously, other points as well. Now, 1760, a Frenchman pretending to be a Scottish nobleman called George Frederick Johnson introduced the Templar connection to German Freemasonry. Now, Germany didn't really like the egalitarianism of the British version, and so they started to add Gothic bits and pieces, sort of an occult flavor to the whole thing. So what happens is Johnson and his party stated that the Templars learned from the Essenes, the people who created the Dead Sea Scrolls. De Molay supposedly ordered the treasure to be brought out of Paris and taken to La Rochelle for ship to Scotland, where the Templars could become Freemasons. Now, in Germany, we saw Karl Gotthelf von Hund institute what he called the Rite of the Strict Observance, which added a Templar degree to German Freemasonry. He also introduced what he called the Superiores Incogniti, the unknown superiors, who ruled the rite and had to be obeyed. He may or may not have been the one who spread the rumor that the head of the rite was Bonnie Prince Charlie. This is the exiled Jacobite Scottish king. Now, Jacobite exiles did tend to be involved in continental masonry. Moving on to the Scottish context, we don't really need to talk about it in too much detail. The simple fact is that the 18th and 19th centuries saw real profusion of new orders and degrees and societies, many of whom worked up late antique and medieval backgrounds for themselves. So the existence of Templar orders within Scottish Masonry is just part of this context. And of course, Romanticism encourages that even further. Now, in 1843, what we see is a publication of something called the Historical Notices of the Order. It was published by a group calling themselves the Order of the Knights Templar in Scotland. And this advanced the Bannockburn myth that we've already heard about. So basically, fantasy is being accepted as fact. The myth is accepted as reality. Now, as a point of comparison, I would like to finish by talking about a different group, similar to the Freemasons in a lot of ways, coming from the same time period and having the same sort of ambiguous relationship with medieval material. So this is the Rosy Cross, or the Rosicrucians. And the order supposedly begins with Christian Rosencreutz, who was, we are told, born in 1378. Was a young man who entered a monastery but wasn't satisfied with the monastic life. So he decided to visit the Holy Land, hook up with Arab mystics, and develop a personally non-papally oriented form of Christianity. Now, his secret society, supposedly, operated to provide aid and comfort to the sick and needy. They dressed anonymously to blend in. They were identified with the symbol of the rose and the cross. They would meet annually at the Sancti Spiritus, their headquarters, their unknown headquarters, and each brother would name his successor to be known only on his death. Rosencreutz supposedly lived until 106 years of age, but there is no record in the historical records of him or his brothers until 130 years later. So what we see are more key documents. First of all is the Fama Fraternitas manuscript from 1614, which is the declaration of the Worthy Order of the Rosy Cross. 1615, there was a pamphlet talking about the discovery of Rosenkreutz's tomb in 1604 and how his body was undecayed. And in 1616, the big one, the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, which is packed full with references to the Templars, and it spurred huge interest in the order and their supposedly secret meetings. The key symbols here were the cross with equal arms, which is a symbol of medieval alchemists, the rose and the cross, which was also in the family arms of Martin Luther, and also could be seen as an adaptation of the Red Cross of the Templars. So there was said to have been many Rosicrucian groups, and the idea at this point in European history that there's the secret brotherhood of alchemists and sages who were going to step out into the 17th century and transform Europe with their secret knowledge would have been very exciting. So all you have to do is think about the wars, so the political wars and religious wars going on at the time, and how attractive the concept of renewal would actually have been. Now, Michael Meyer was a very high-ranking person in the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, and he argued that the Rosicrucians were there to inspire arts and science. Also, that their practice of alchemy was of a spiritual and symbolic sort, not the actual production of gold. Now, whereas other writers argued that the Rosicrucians had actually left Western Europe and they had headed east during the 30 Years' War. As the century continued, we start to see more elaboration upon the supposed background of the order. Various writers said that Francis Bacon was a member, John Dee, the astrologer to Queen Elizabeth I, Robert Boyle. They argued that the Rosicrucians had actually inspired the Invisible College, which is what led to the founding of the Royal Society in England. And yeah, the Invisible College is generally seen as a precursor organization, possibly. That's somewhat disputed now, just because we have so few actual documentary sources for the existence of the Invisible College. Now, Bacon in particular became the focus for additional conspiracy theories. One in particular says that he created Shakespeare's works, which were preaching the virtues of Rosicrucianism. This was based on the idea that there are cipher codes in the plays. I'm not going to get into that. Shakespeare conspiracy theories are a little bit beyond me, even so. So the problem with all of this, as convincing and as consistent as it sounds, is that according to Johann Valentin Andreae, a Lutheran pastor, the chemical wedding and the other two documents were his creation. It's a modern hoax. Of course, not everybody believed this. It is a conspiracy, right? You get pushback against the existence of the secret society. This just convinces you that, yeah, it's out there. Now, why were they so popular? Part of it is the printing press. Their pamphlets could be printed en masse and spread around. The other issue is really that the truth about Christian Rosencreutz didn't really matter. The idea was one whose time had come, so to speak. Some of the early modern members of the Rosicrucian groups merged with the Masons because there was a great deal that was quite similar between their ideologies. So this is why we see Rosicrucian elements within Freemasonry. We also see later Rosicrucian groups that are still independent. You might call them neo-Rosicrucians, I suppose. Now, there are some late 18th century Rosicrucian writers who, instead of merging with the Masons, tie the order to Gnosticism or the Egyptian mysteries. Maurice Maigret, for instance, called Rosencreutz the last descendant of a 13th century German family raised by the Albigensians, who were the people who harbored the Cathars. So this contributes to the idea of this grand conspiratorial narrative where all of these secret groups are linked together and linked together back in time. This is very common of Umberto Eco's concept of the Middle Ages of tradition. So this esoteric, ramshackle esoteric framework that animates so many different conspiracy theories. Okay, that should do it for today. Thanks very much, guys, and we will talk again soon.